Sir, if you don't have $600 by tomorrow morning, you and your daughter will be out on the street. Ethan Walker stood frozen in the doorway of his trailer, the eviction notice trembling in his hand, while behind him, his 8-year-old daughter Lily wheezed for air on the couch. $35. That was all he had left in the world. No job, no insurance, no one to call. Just a little girl who needed her medicine and a father who had run out of ways to save her. Before we continue, if stories like this move you, stories of ordinary people pushed to the edge and the unexpected hands that pull them back, please hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end. And I'd love to know, what city are you watching from tonight? Drop it in the comments so I can see just how far this story has traveled. The trailer smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, and the only sound louder than the wind rattling the thin walls was the sound of Lily's breathing. In out, too fast, too shallow. Ethan Walker knelt beside the couch, his big calloused hand pressed against his daughter's small chest, feeling the way it hitched with every breath like something inside her was fighting to stay open. "Daddy?" she whispered, her lips a little pale. "It hurts when I breathe. I know, baby, I know." His voice cracked in a way he hated. He was supposed to be the strong one. He was supposed to fix this. "Just breathe slow for me, like we practiced. In through your nose." She tried. Her small chest rose, shuddered, fell. Ethan reached for the inhaler on the coffee table and shook it. Empty. He'd known it was almost empty for 2 days, now had been rationing the last puffs, like a man rationing water in a desert, praying each one would be enough to get her through the night. It wasn't going to be enough tonight. He stood up so fast his knees popped and he had to grab the wall to keep from stumbling. $35. He'd counted it 3 times already that morning, like maybe if he counted it a 4th time, a 5th time more would magically appear between the bills. It never did. $35 and a prescription refill that cost $68. "I'm gonna go get your medicine, okay? I'll be right back." "Don't go," Lily said, and her small hand shot out and grabbed his sleeve with more strength than he expected from someone struggling just to breathe. "Please, Daddy, stay." That was the moment that nearly broke him. Not the eviction notice sitting on the counter, not the empty bank account, not the growling in his own stomach because he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. It was his daughter, scared and gasping, begging him not to leave, and Ethan Walker having no idea how he was going to give her what she needed. "I have to, sweetheart. I promise I'll be fast." He kissed her forehead. Her skin was warm, too warm, and that scared him more than anything. The walk to Miller's diner took 11 minutes if he hurried, and Ethan hurried like his life depended on it, because in a way it did. Every dollar of every shift mattered now. Every minute he wasn't working was a minute closer to losing everything. The trailer, the little bit of stability he'd clawed together for Lily since her mother left 3 years ago, all of it hanging by threads that were fraying faster than he could tie them back together. The diner's neon sign flickered weakly against the gray morning. Half the letters burned out, so it just read MLLRs, like even the building had given up trying to look presentable. Ethan pushed through the door, and the bell above it jingled a sound so familiar it barely registered anymore. Greg Miller was already behind the counter, arms crossed, waiting. And Ethan knew the second he saw that face that something was wrong. "You're late," Greg said. "I'm not late. My shift starts at 7. It's 6:52. "Register's short again. $40 short. Second time this month." Ethan felt his stomach drop through the floor. "Greg, I didn't touch the register. I closed out clean last night. You can check the—" "I did check." Greg's voice was flat, final, the voice of a man who'd already made up his mind before the conversation started. $40 short, Walker. Same as last time. You think I'm stupid? I think somebody's setting me up, or the count's wrong, or—" Ethan's voice rose, panic clawing up his throat. "Greg, please, I need this job. My daughter's sick, I can't—" "That's not my problem." The words landed like a slap. Ethan had worked for this man for 2 years. 2 years of double shifts of covering for Greg's nephew when he no-showed of biting his tongue through every insult about how people like him, meaning poor, meaning desperate, meaning a single father barely keeping his head above water, should be grateful for any job at all. "You're firing me. Over $40 you can't even prove I took. I'm firing you," Greg said, "because I'm tired of dealing with your excuses. Clean out your locker. You're done." For a moment, Ethan couldn't move, couldn't speak. The diner around him, the sizzle of the grill, the low murmur of the two truckers in the corner booth, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, all of it seemed to fade into a dull ringing in his ears. "Please," he said, and hated himself for how small his voice sounded. "Please, Greg, I'll take a pay cut. I'll work doubles. Whatever you need. I can't lose this job. Not now." Greg didn't even look up from the register he was recounting. "Should have thought about that before you started stealing." "I didn't steal anything." The two truckers turned to look. Greg's face went red with something between embarrassment and anger. "Keep your voice down or I'll call the sheriff." "Call him!" Ethan snapped, something finally breaking loose inside him. 2 years of swallowed pride, of silent humiliation, of telling himself it didn't matter what Greg said, as long as the paycheck cleared. "Call the sheriff. Let him look at your books. Let him see what's actually going on around here." That was the wrong thing to say. He knew it the second it left his mouth. Greg's eyes went cold and narrow. "Get out," Greg said quietly. "Get out of my diner before I have you removed." Ethan stood there another second, chest heaving, fists clenched at his sides, and then something in him just collapsed. The fight went out of him all at once, like air from a punctured tire. What was the point? He had no proof. He had no lawyer. He had a sick daughter at home and $35 in his wallet, and a boss who'd already decided he was a thief. He turned and walked out without another word. The cold outside hit him like a wall, and Ethan stood on the cracked sidewalk in front of the diner for a long moment, just breathing, trying to think, trying to feel anything other than the hollow, sick dread spreading through his chest. No job, no paycheck coming. $68 he didn't have for Lily's inhaler. And somewhere in his jacket pocket, folded into quarters like it might hurt less that way, an eviction notice demanding $600 by tomorrow morning, or the sheriff's department would be at his door with a lockbox and a moving crew. He'd been so close to catching up. One more paycheck, he'd told himself. One more and I make rent and I get her medicine early this time, and maybe we get a little breathing room. There was no breathing room now. Not for him. Not for Lily. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his landlord, Mr. Hendricks, a man who'd been patient for months, but whose patience had clearly run out. Ethan, final notice as discussed. $600 due by 9 a.m. tomorrow or the eviction proceeds. I'm sorry, but I have my own bills. Ethan closed his eyes. He thought about calling his sister in Ohio, but they hadn't spoken in over a year, not since the blow-up at their mother's funeral. He thought about the food bank, about the church on 5th Street, about 100 small, humiliating solutions that wouldn't add up to $600 by morning, no matter how he stacked them. He started walking home because there was nothing else to do, and every step felt heavier than the last. When he pushed open the trailer door, the first thing he heard was Lily's breathing. Worse now, a high, thin whistle on every inhale that made his blood run cold. Lily. Daddy. She gasped from the couch, her small body curled tight, hands clutching at her chest, like she could physically pull more air into her lungs. Her lips had a faint bluish tint at the edges that hadn't been there before. I can't breathe right. Okay, baby, I'm here. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, his mind racing through everything he knew about asthma attacks, every instruction the doctor had given him 100 times. Sit up for me. Sit up straight, that's it. Lean forward a little. He grabbed the empty inhaler anyway, shook it desperately, put it to her lips. One weak puff came out, barely anything more air than medicine, but her breathing hitched, caught, steadied by a fraction. That's it, baby. Slow breaths. In and out. You're doing so good. Inside, Ethan was screaming. This wasn't enough. This inhaler was basically empty. She needed the real thing. She needed a hospital maybe. And he had $35 and no car that ran reliably, and no insurance card that actually worked since the coverage lapsed 2 months ago when he couldn't make the premium. Should I take you to the hospital? He asked more to himself than to her, already running the math in his head. The ambulance, he couldn't afford the ER bill that would bury them both. The walk that would take 40 minutes, he didn't think she had. No, Lily said between wheezes, shaking her head with surprising force. No hospital. Too much money. You said. Ethan felt something crack open in his chest. 8 years old, and his daughter was already rationing his despair for him, already keeping a ledger of what he could and couldn't afford, already protecting him from his own failures. Don't you worry about money, he said, his voice fierce and shaking at the same time. Don't you ever worry about that. That's my job, not yours. But I heard you, she whispered. On the phone, with the landlord man. Ethan closed his eyes. Of course she'd heard. The walls in this trailer were paper thin, and she was smarter than any 8-year-old had a right to be sharpened by years of watching her father hold together a life with tape and prayers. We're gonna be okay, he told her, and he wasn't sure if he believed it, but he said it anyway because that was the only thing he had left to give her. I promise you, Lily, we're gonna be okay. Her breathing slowly evened out the weak puff of medicine and the sheer force of her own will pulling her back from the edge, at least for now. Ethan sat on the floor next to the couch and held her hand until she drifted into an exhausted, shallow sleep. Then, and only then, did he let himself put his face in his hands and shake. He didn't cry often. Hadn't cried at his own mother's funeral, hadn't cried when Lily's mother packed a bag 3 years ago and said she wasn't built for this kind of life, and left without a single look back. But sitting on the floor of a trailer that would legally belong to someone else by tomorrow morning, listening to his sick daughter's uneven breathing. Ethan Walker cried like something in him had finally completely given out. He cried for maybe 2 minutes. Then he wiped his face with the back of his hand because crying didn't pay rent and it didn't fill inhalers, and he made himself stand up. $35. He counted it again, force of habit, now a nervous ritual, and this time instead of putting it back in his wallet, he shoved it into his jacket pocket and grabbed his keys. I'm not giving up, he said out loud to the empty room, to Lily's sleeping form, to no one at all. Not today, not ever. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have a job anymore, or a way to make $600 appear before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, or any real reason to believe things were about to get better instead of worse. All he had was a stubborn, burning refusal to let his daughter go without, and the kind of desperate momentum that comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose. He checked on Lily one more time. Her breathing had settled into something more, even more peaceful, and for now, that would have to be enough. And then he stepped back outside into the cold afternoon, his mind spinning through every terrible option available to a man with $35 and no job. Pawn shop. He had nothing left to pawn. He'd sold his father's old watch 2 months ago for grocery money. Payday loan place. He'd been down that road before, and it had nearly swallowed him whole with interest that compounded faster than he could ever pay it down. Ask a stranger for help. The thought made his face burn with shame just considering it. He was still turning it over in his mind, walking nowhere in particular, when the low, rolling thunder of motorcycle engines rumbled up the road behind him, a sound that made every hair on his arm stand up, though he couldn't have said why. He turned around, and that was when he saw them for the first time, a line of bikes coming down Main Street toward Miller's Diner. Black leather and chrome, a sound like distant thunder that seemed to shake something loose in the quiet, defeated air of Oak Haven. Ethan Walker had no idea, standing there on that cracked sidewalk, with $35 in his pocket and nothing left to believe in, that the men riding those motorcycles were about to change everything about the life he thought he understood. He just stood there and watched them pass, feeling for reasons he couldn't explain, the smallest, strangest flicker of something he hadn't felt all day. Something that almost felt like hope. Orchestrated, dialogue-driven narrative, voy multiple mini-climaxes, va twist l'on. Orchestrated dialogue-driven narrative, void multiple mini-climaxes, but twist long. Ethan didn't move from that sidewalk until the last bike had rumbled past and turned into the gravel lot outside Miller's diner. Something about the sound of those engines settling into silence pulled at him some instinct he couldn't name, and before he even decided to do it, his feet were already carrying him back the way he came. He told himself it was curiosity. He told himself he just wanted to see who they were. Why a dozen or more leather-clad strangers on chrome machines had rolled into a town as forgettable as Oak Haven. But some smaller, more honest part of him knew the truth. He had nowhere else to go, and nothing left to lose, and watching something happen to somebody else's life felt easier than sitting alone with the wreckage of his own. By the time he reached the diner window, the bikes were lined up outside like a row of sleeping animals, and through the glass he could see them settling into booths. Big men in worn leather vests, patches on their backs, he didn't recognize. At the front of them, a tall man with graying hair pulled back and lines carved deep into a weathered face was speaking quietly to the others, calm in a way that seemed to settle the whole room around him. Ethan pressed closer to the glass without meaning to. Inside, Greg Miller was already moving toward them with the same tight, suspicious posture he'd worn an hour earlier while accusing Ethan of theft. His voice carried through the thin door when it swung open for another customer. "We don't want trouble in here," Greg was saying loud enough for the whole diner to hear. "You boys can eat, but keep it quiet. I don't need my other customers scared off." The tall man, the one who seemed to be leading the group, just nodded once unbothered. "We're just here for breakfast," he said. "That's all?" "Mm-hmm," Greg muttered, already backing away like he expected a fight that hadn't come. Ethan felt something twist in his chest watching it. He knew that tone. He'd heard that same dismissive, suspicious sneer aimed at himself 100 times. Over 2 years, the assumption that a person wearing the wrong kind of clothes, driving the wrong kind of vehicle, standing in the wrong economic bracket was automatically guilty of something. He almost laughed bitter and hollow standing there outside in the cold. An hour ago, he'd been the one accused of stealing. Now it was a dozen strangers on motorcycles. Same diner, same man, same ugly instinct to look down on anyone who didn't fit a tidy little picture of respectability. He should have walked away. He told himself that later, a dozen times, he should have just turned around and gone back to Lily, back to the four walls that would legally belong to someone else by morning, and let whatever was happening inside that diner happen without him. But he didn't. He stood there half hidden by the corner of the building and watched. A police cruiser pulled into the lot a few minutes later, lights off, moving slow and deliberate. Sheriff Dawson climbed out, adjusting his belt, his eyes already fixed on the row of motorcycles like they'd personally insulted him. "Great," Ethan muttered under his breath. Dawson wasn't known in Oak Haven for measured judgment. He was known for pulling over anyone driving anything louder than a sedan, for treating every stranger passing through town like a threat until proven otherwise, and for enjoying the small petty authority of a badge in a town too poor and too tired to push back. Dawson walked into the diner without knocking, without hesitating, hand resting on his belt in a way that made Ethan's stomach clench even from outside. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Dawson said, and there was nothing friendly in the way he said it. "Mind telling me what brings the Hells Angels to my town?" The tall man at the front of the group, the one the others seemed to orbit around without being told to, looked up from his coffee with an expression of calm that seemed almost designed to needle Dawson further. "Breakfast, Sheriff," he said. "Same as everyone else in here." "That's so." Dawson's eyes swept over the room, cataloging faces, patches the worn leather and road dust, like each one was evidence in a case he was already building. "We don't usually see your kind stopping in Oak Haven." "No trouble intended," the man said. "We'll eat pay and be on our way. See that you do." Dawson's tone made it clear he wasn't finished being suspicious, just finished saying so out loud for now. He turned toward Greg, who was practically vibrating with nervous energy behind the counter. "You call if there's any problem, Miller. Any problem at all." "Will do, Sheriff," Greg said, too quickly, too eager. Dawson gave the room one last hard look before walking back out, boots heavy on the linoleum, and climbed back into his cruiser. Ethan watched him go, heart-pounding for reasons he couldn't fully explain. Some instinct telling him that what he'd just witnessed mattered, though he had no idea yet how much. Through the window, he watched the leader of the bikers go back to his coffee unbothered, while the men around him exchanged glances but said nothing. There was something in the quiet way they carried themselves that didn't match anything Ethan had expected. He'd grown up hearing stories about the Hells Angels, the kind of stories meant to scare, meant to warn, and yet here they sat polite to a waitress who looked terrified to approach their table, patient with a sheriff who'd all but accused them of a crime they hadn't committed, calm in the face of a diner owner who clearly wanted them gone. It reminded him of something. It reminded him uncomfortably of himself an hour earlier, trying to stay calm while Greg tore his dignity apart over $40 that didn't exist. He turned to walk away. He really did try this time, he told himself later. And that was when his phone rang. It was Mr. Hendricks, the landlord. Ethan's whole body went cold. He almost didn't answer. Whatever this call was, it wasn't going to be good news, not on a day like this, not with a clock ticking down toward 9 o'clock tomorrow morning and $600 he didn't have and never would in time. He answered anyway. Hello. Ethan. Hendricks's voice was tired, apologetic, the voice of a man who hated his own job today. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Okay. Do you have any part of that 600? Even part of it, I might be able to work something out if you've got... I have $35, Ethan said, and the words tasted like ash coming out of his mouth. Saying it out loud made it more real, somehow, more final. That's it. That's everything I have. There was a long silence on the line. Ethan, I'm sorry. I really am. You're a good tenant. You've always paid when you could, but I've got my own mortgage, my own bills, and I can't keep floating you month to month. If you don't have the money by tomorrow, the eviction goes through. That's not me being cruel. That's just... I understand. Ethan said, because there was nothing else to say, no argument that would change a math problem that simply didn't add up. I understand, Mr. Hendricks. He hung up before his voice could break in front of a stranger standing in the cold outside a diner that had just fired him, holding a phone that had just confirmed the end of the only home his daughter had ever known. For a moment, the whole world seemed to tilt sideways. He thought about Lily on the couch, her lips gone pale, her small hand gripping his sleeve. He thought about the empty inhaler, the eviction notice folded into quarters in his jacket pocket, the $68 for medicine he didn't have, and the $600 for rent he definitely didn't have, and something in him, something exhausted and raw and stretched past its breaking point, simply gave out. He sat down right there on the curb outside the diner in full view of anyone who cared to look and put his head in his hands. He didn't hear the door of the diner open. He didn't notice the tall man from inside step out onto the sidewalk, glance around, and then walk toward him with the unhurried, deliberate steps of someone who'd spent a whole life learning not to spook people who were already scared. You all right, friend? Ethan's head snapped up. The man standing over him was older than he'd looked through the window, maybe 60, with a face that had clearly weathered more than its share of hard years, deep lines around eyes that were surprisingly kind. I'm fine, Ethan said automatically. The reflexive lie of a man who'd spent his whole life refusing to burden anyone else with his problems. The man raised an eyebrow, unconvinced, but he didn't push. Name's Jim. Jim Hannon. He extended a hand. Ethan hesitated only a second before shaking it. The grip was firm, callous, the hand of someone who'd worked with his hands his whole life. Ethan Walker. You work here? Jim nodded toward the diner behind him. Used to. Ethan's laugh came out bitter and short. Got fired about an hour ago. Something shifted in Jim's expression. Not pity exactly, but attention, the kind of focused listening most people didn't bother giving strangers on curbs. What happened? Ethan almost brushed it off. Almost said it didn't matter. Said he was fine. Said all the things he'd been saying to everyone all day, to keep from falling apart completely. But something about the way Jim Hannon stood there, patient, unhurried, genuinely waiting for an answer, instead of just being polite, made the words come pouring out before he could stop them. Boss said the register was short, $40. Said it was the second time. I told him I didn't touch it, that I closed clean last night, but he didn't care. Fired me on the spot. Ethan shook his head, staring at the cracked pavement between his boots. Doesn't matter now anyway. Doesn't matter if I'm right or wrong. I've got $35 to my name. My daughter's got asthma and no medicine, and I'm getting evicted tomorrow morning if I don't come up with $600 I don't have. He hadn't meant to say all of it. He hadn't meant to say any of it honestly to a total stranger on a sidewalk. But once it started, it wouldn't stop like a dam that had been holding back too much water for too long. Jim Hannon didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at Ethan, really looked at him the way almost nobody had bothered to look at him in longer than he could remember, and something passed behind those weathered eyes that Ethan couldn't quite read. Your daughter, Jim said finally. How old? 8. She okay right now? She's sleeping, for now. Ethan's jaw tightened. Her inhaler's basically empty. I don't know what I'm gonna do if she has another attack tonight. Jim nodded slowly, taking that in his face, unreadable. You said your boss accused you of stealing $40. Yeah. You didn't do it. It wasn't a question, but Ethan answered anyway. No, I didn't. How do you know? The question caught Ethan off guard. Not hostile, just direct, the way a man asks a question when he actually wants the true answer instead of the easy one. Because I counted that drawer myself before I closed. Twice. I always count twice, ever since he accused me the first time a few weeks back. It was right. Every dollar accounted for. I don't know what happened between when I left and this morning, but it wasn't me. Jim studied him for a long moment, and Ethan had the strange, uncomfortable sensation of being evaluated by someone whose judgment mattered more than it should for a stranger he'd known less than 5 minutes. You didn't fight back in there, Jim said. When he fired you, I tried. He wasn't listening. I don't have proof. I don't have a lawyer. I don't have anything but my word, and my word doesn't mean much to a man who's already decided I'm guilty. Ethan let out a long breath. Doesn't matter anyway. Won't get my job back. Won't get my daughter her medicine. Won't stop the eviction. Nothing about being right is going to fix any of that by tomorrow morning. The diner door opened behind them, and Greg Miller stepped halfway out, scanning the parking lot with obvious irritation. Walker! What are you still doing here? I told you to clear out. Ethan flinched, an old tired reflex, but before he could answer, Jim Hannon turned toward Greg with an expression that had gone suddenly quietly hard. He's talking to me, Jim said. That a problem, eh? Greg's mouth opened, then closed. Something in Jim's tone, calm level, but with an unmistakable edge underneath it, made him think better of whatever he'd been about to say. No problem, he muttered, and disappeared back inside. Jim turned back to Ethan, and just like that, the hardness melted back into that same unhurried patience. Tell me something, Ethan. You said you counted that drawer twice before you left. You keep any kind of record of that, notes, receipts, anything? Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the specificity of the question. Yeah, actually. I write the closing totals in a little notebook I keep in my locker. Habit from another job years back where they wanted a paper trail. Never thought it'd matter here, but I kept doing it anyway. Something flickered across Jim's face, interest, sharp and sudden. You still got that notebook? Should be, in my locker, assuming Greg hasn't thrown my stuff out on the sidewalk already. Ethan gave a hollow laugh. Why does that matter? Jim didn't answer right away. He glanced back toward the diner window where Greg was visibly agitated, moving fast behind the counter, glancing out at them more than once, with an expression that had shifted from irritation into something closer to nervousness. Might not be anything, Jim said slowly. But in my experience, a man who fires somebody that fast over an accusation he can't prove and gets this twitchy when a stranger starts asking questions about it, that's usually a man with something to hide. Ethan felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation stir in his chest, something between hope and disbelief. Two things that had abandoned him hours ago and had no business coming back now over a conversation with a stranger on a sidewalk. "You think Greg's lying?" "I think," Jim said carefully, "that men like your boss usually blame somebody else first, especially when the numbers don't add up on their own end." He paused, watching Ethan's face. "But that's not really my business. My business right now is that you've got a sick little girl and $35, and that's not right regardless of who's stealing what from who." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. Nobody had said anything like that to him in longer than he could remember, not with that kind of plain, unshakable conviction, like it was simply a fact of the universe that a man shouldn't have to watch his daughter struggle to breathe because of $35. "I appreciate the thought," Ethan said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "But I don't need charity. I'll figure something out." Something almost like a smile tugged at the corner of Jim's mouth. "Didn't say anything about charity." Before Ethan could ask what that meant, the diner door swung open hard, and Sheriff Dawson's cruiser pulled back into the lot lights flashing. This time, tires crunching too fast against gravel. Ethan's stomach dropped straight through the pavement. Dawson climbed out fast, hand already resting on his belt, eyes locked on the two of them like he'd interrupted something. "Walker," he barked. "Miller says you're harassing his customers." "I'm not harassing anybody," Ethan said, his voice tightening with a fresh spike of panic. This was the last thing he needed, a confrontation with Dawson, on top of everything else. On the same day, he'd already been fired and evicted and humiliated in front of half the town. "That's not what I heard." Dawson's eyes flicked to Jim, narrowing further. "This one of your boys bothering him." "Nobody's bothering anybody, Sheriff," Jim said, and his voice had gone flat and steady in a way that somehow made Dawson's aggressive posture look almost childish by comparison. "We were just talking." "About what?" "About the fact that this man just lost his job over an accusation nobody's bothered to actually check," Jim said, unbothered by Dawson's tone. "Funny thing to be worried about, Sheriff, when there's actual criminals somewhere in this county, I'd imagine." Dawson's face flushed red. "You threatening me?" "Just making an observation." For a moment, the tension between them stretched thin enough to snap, and Ethan found himself frozen between two men who clearly didn't like each other, caught in the crossfire of a confrontation he hadn't asked for and couldn't afford to be part of. "Walker," Dawson snapped, turning his glare back onto Ethan. "Get out of here before I run you in for loitering." Loitering. Ethan almost laughed at the absurdity of it, a grown man threatened with arrest for standing on a public sidewalk on the worst day of his life, for the crime of talking to a stranger who'd shown him more basic decency in 5 minutes than his own boss had shown him in 2 years. "Fine. I'm leaving." He turned to go, humiliation burning hot in his chest, and that was when Jim Hannon's voice stopped him cold. "Ethan." He turned back. "Where do you live?" Jim asked, ignoring Dawson's glare entirely, like the sheriff had already stopped existing the moment he'd asked his question. Ethan hesitated, some old instinct warning him not to give his address to a stranger, however kind that stranger had seemed. But something in Jim's eyes, steady, sincere, utterly without threat, made the hesitation crumble. "Sunny Acres Trailer Park," he said quietly. "Lot 14. Jim nodded once, filing the information away without any visible reaction. "Go home. Take care of your girl." Dawson made a disgusted noise in the back of his throat, clearly unhappy that his authority had been so thoroughly ignored. But he didn't push it further, not with a dozen bikers watching from the diner window, not with Jim Hannon standing there with the calm, immovable presence of a man who'd faced down far worse than a small-town sheriff with a chip on his shoulder. Ethan walked away from that diner for the second time that day, his mind spinning his chest tight with a confusing tangle of humiliation and something else, something he didn't dare name yet. Some small, fragile thread of hope he was terrified to hold on to, because hope in his experience only made the eventual disappointment hurt worse. By the time he made it back to the trailer, the sun had shifted low in the sky, casting everything in a tired orange light that felt almost mocking against the wreckage of his day. He pushed open the door as quietly as he could, praying Lily was still asleep, still breathing steady. She was awake, sitting up on the couch, her color better than it had been that morning, but still pale, still fragile, in a way that made his heart clench every time he looked at her. "Daddy?" Her voice was small. "Did you get my medicine?" The question hit him like a fist to the chest. He'd forgotten for one terrible guilty moment, standing outside that diner, talking to a stranger about hope and charity and men who might be lying. He'd forgotten even for a second that the entire reason any of this mattered was the little girl in front of him, gasping for the breath he couldn't buy her. "Not yet, baby," he said, kneeling down beside the couch, forcing his voice to stay steady, even as everything inside him was screaming. "But I'm gonna figure it out. I promise you." "You always say that," Lily said, and there was no accusation in it. Just a tired, matter-of-fact observation from a little girl who'd learned to read her father's promises the way other kids read bedtime stories. Familiar, comforting, and not always something you could count on coming true. Those words landed harder than anything Greg Miller or Sheriff Dawson had said to him all day. Harder than the eviction notice. Harder than the empty inhaler. "I know," Ethan whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I know I do. But I mean it this time, Lily. I promise you I mean it." He didn't know, kneeling there beside his daughter with $35 and a broken promise history stacked up behind him, that somewhere across town a phone call was being made. One man to another. Low voices discussing numbers on a ledger. Nobody was supposed to be looking at a forged signature that didn't quite match a pattern of small thefts blamed on whichever employee happened to be most disposable that month. He didn't know that Jim Hannon had already pulled a notebook from his jacket, jotting down an address in messy, deliberate handwriting, Sunny Acres Lot 14, while the rest of his crew finished their coffee in a diner whose owner was growing more nervous by the minute. And he certainly didn't know that in less than 24 hours, the sound of a dozen motorcycle engines rumbling down a gravel road toward his trailer would mark the exact moment his entire life stopped falling apart and started impossibly coming back together. For now, all Ethan Walker knew was the ragged sound of his daughter's breathing, the empty ache in his stomach, and the eviction notice sitting on the counter like a countdown clock ticking toward morning, $35 standing between his family and the edge of everything. He held Lily's hand until her breathing steadied into sleep again, and then he sat alone in the dark, staring at his phone, at the $600 he didn't have, at a day that had taken everything from him except the one thing he refused to let go of. Outside, somewhere beyond the thin trailer walls, the night had gone quiet, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that comes right before something changes. Orchestrated climactic narrative finale. Voy Hell's Angels. Dialogue-driven storytelling. Orchestrated climactic narrative finale. Voy Hell's Angels. Dialogue-driven storytelling. Ethan didn't remember falling asleep, but he woke with a jolt just past midnight, his neck stiff from the angle he'd slumped into against the couch. Lily's small hand still curled loosely around two of his fingers. For a moment, he panicked, listening hard for her breathing, before he registered it steady, even quiet in a way it hadn't been all day. Relief hit him so hard it almost hurt. He eased his hand free and sat there in the dark, staring at the eviction notice on the counter like it might disappear if he looked at it long enough. It didn't. 9 o'clock. $600. Less than 9 hours away now, and he had exactly the same $35 he'd had all day, minus nothing, because there'd been nothing left to spend it on that would have mattered. He didn't sleep again. He sat in the dark, running numbers that refused to add up, turning over every possible option in his mind, until they blurred into the same impossible math no matter how he arranged them. When the first gray light of morning finally crept through the thin curtains, he felt like he'd aged 10 years overnight. Lily woke a little after 7, her color better, her breathing rough but manageable. She looked at him with the particular searching expression of a child trying to read whether things were as bad as they'd seemed the night before. "Are we okay?" she asked. Ethan forced a smile onto a face that felt like it had forgotten how. "We're gonna be fine, baby. I'm gonna go figure some things out this morning. You stay here and rest." "Okay. Drink your water. Use the inhaler slow if you need it. There's barely anything left in it." "I know. I'll get more today." He said it with more conviction than he had any right to. But her small, worried face needed the words more than it needed his honesty right then. He'd just pulled his jacket back on, mentally rehearsing the humiliating speech he'd have to give at the county assistant's office the second it opened when he heard it the same low-rolling thunder from yesterday's engines. This time closer, unmistakable, growing louder instead of fading into the distance. His stomach dropped straight through the floor. "Daddy!" Lily's voice went thin with alarm. "What is that?" "I don't know," Ethan said, though some part of him already suspected, already felt his pulse spike with a confused tangle of fear and something he refused to call hope. He crossed to the window and pulled the thin curtain aside, and what he saw outside made his knees nearly buckle. Motorcycles. A dozen of them more rolling slow and deliberate down the gravel lane between the trailer's engines, idling low like a held breath. Every window in Sunny Acres was twitching with curtains pulled aside, neighbors peering out at a sight that had never once happened in this forgotten corner of Oak Haven. At the front of the pack, Jim Hannon swung his leg off his bike and stood there scanning the row of trailers until his eyes landed on Lot 14. Ethan's first instinct was pure animal panic. He thought of every worst-case scenario his exhausted brain could conjure, that Jim had somehow gotten the wrong idea about him, that this was retaliation for something Ethan didn't understand, that a dozen strangers on motorcycles showing up at his home at 7 in the morning could not possibly mean anything good. "Stay inside," he told Lily, his voice tight, and stepped out onto the cracked concrete step, with his heart hammering against his ribs. "Jim." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Is something wrong?" "Jim." Hannon walked toward him, unhurried, the rest of his crew hanging back near the bikes, and there was something in his expression that Ethan couldn't quite place. Not threat, not the grim purposefulness he might have expected, but something almost gentle. "Morning, Ethan," Jim said. "Sorry for the early hour, and for the noise. Figured you'd rather we came now than have your neighbors wondering all day." Came for what? Ethan's mind was racing, still braced for something terrible. Jim reached into the inside pocket of his leather vest and pulled out a thick envelope, worn soft at the edges, like it had been handled and rehandled, folded and unfolded a dozen times overnight. "We talked to some people," Jim said. "Made some calls. Did some asking around about your Mr. Miller and that diner of his." He held the envelope out. "And we took up a collection. Boys chipped in what they could, and a few of us added a little more on top." Ethan stared at the envelope like it might bite him. "I don't understand." "Open it." His hands were shaking. Actually shaking, he realized distantly as he took the envelope and folded back the flap. Inside was a thick stack of bills, more cash than Ethan had seen in one place in years, rubber banded together with a scrap of paper tucked on top. "Go on," Jim said quietly. "Count it if you want. We won't be offended." Ethan's fingers fumbled through the bills, and the number rising in his head refused to feel real, even as he counted it. 3,000. 3,200. $3,300. His vision blurred, and for a moment he genuinely could not speak, could not process what he was holding, standing on the cracked step of a trailer he'd been certain he'd lose in less than 2 hours. "This is..." His voice cracked completely. "I can't take this. This is too much. I can't." "You can," Jim said simply. "And you will." "Why?" The word came out desperate, almost accusatory, like Ethan needed there to be some catch, some price tag hidden underneath an act of kindness too large to trust. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me. You met me yesterday for 5 minutes on a sidewalk." Jim's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes softened. "Because yesterday I watched a man get accused of something he didn't do, get his whole life ripped out from under him in front of a room full of strangers, and instead of screaming or running or lying down and taking it, you told the truth, even when it cost you everything. Most people don't do that anymore. Most people fold the second it gets expensive, to be honest." "That doesn't mean I deserve..." "It means exactly that," Jim cut in, and for the first time, there was an edge in his voice, not anger, but conviction, deep and unshakable. "We've all had someone look at us and decide who we were before we said a single word. Every man standing behind me has had a cop pull him over for nothing but the patch on his back. Had a diner owner refuse to serve him. Had folks cross the street rather than walk past him. He gestured back toward the men waiting by their bikes. We know what it's like to be judged and dismissed before anybody bothers asking the truth. Yesterday we watched it happen to you. We're not going to pretend we didn't see it. Ethan's throat had gone tight, and he had to look away for a second, blinking hard against something he refused to let fall in front of these strangers who had just handed him more money than he'd earned in the last 4 months combined. My daughter, he said finally, voice raw. She's got asthma. Bad. I couldn't afford her medicine. I couldn't. He stopped, pressed the back of his hand hard against his mouth for a second, and tried again. This is gonna save her life. You understand that? This isn't just rent money. This is her life. Something shifted in Jim's face, a flicker of old pain quickly buried but not quick enough for Ethan to miss it entirely. I understand better than you might think, Jim said quietly. Go take care of her. Rent medicine, whatever she needs. That's what this is for. Ethan looked down at the envelope in his trembling hands, then back up at Jim, then past him at the row of men standing by their bikes. Men's society had taught him to fear to cross the street from, to lock his car doors around, and felt something inside him crack wide open with shame at how wrong he'd been to ever assume anything about them at all. Thank you, he said, and the words felt impossibly small for what they were meant to carry. I don't know how I'll ever pay this back. You don't, Jim said. That's not how this works. Somebody helped me once a long time ago when I had nothing and nobody. Didn't ask for anything back either. Just told me to pass it forward when I got the chance. He held Ethan's gaze steady. This is me passing it forward. Someday it'll be your turn to do the same for somebody else. That's the only payment anybody needs. Before Ethan could respond, the trailer door creaked open behind him, and Lily peeked out, wide-eyed, staring at the row of motorcycles and leather-clad strangers with the particular fearless curiosity only children seem to possess. Daddy, who are they? Jim crouched down slightly, meeting her at something closer to her height, his weathered face breaking into a gentle smile that transformed his whole demeanor. Hi there, I'm Jim. You must be Lily. Lily studied him with the serious assessing gaze of an 8-year-old deciding whether a stranger could be trusted. Are you a bad guy? Lily. Ethan started mortified, but Jim just laughed low and warm. Fair question, Jim said. No, sweetheart. We're not bad guys. We just heard your daddy needed a little help, and we like to help people when we can. Because he's a good daddy. Lily said matter of fact, like it was simply an established truth of the universe. He always tries really hard even when things are bad. Something in Jim's expression cracked open at that, raw and unguarded for just a moment before he composed himself again. Yeah, he said softly. I got that impression too. Ethan felt his throat tighten again, watching his daughter pale, still recovering, still fragile. Stand there, charming a stranger who'd just handed her father enough money to save both their lives, without any idea of the magnitude of what had just happened. One of the other bikers stepped forward, then a broad-shouldered man with graying stubble and a patch that read Road Captain beneath the Hells Angels emblem on his vest. Jim, he said quietly, you might want to see this. He held up a phone, the screen angled toward Jim, and Ethan watched Jim's expression shift from warmth to something sharper, more focused. What is it? Ethan asked, unable to keep the nervous edge out of his voice. Jim glanced at him, then back at the phone, then made a decision. One of my guys has a cousin who used to wait tables at that diner. She still keeps in touch with a couple people there. He turned the phone slightly so Ethan could see. Seems your old boss has had a habit of blaming register shortages on whoever he's trying to push out. You're not the first one this happened to. Won't be the last unless somebody stops him. Ethan's stomach twisted. You're serious. Dead serious. Jim's jaw tightened. Girl before you worked there about 8 months back, same story. Accused of skimming, fired on the spot, no proof, nothing. She didn't fight it. Just left town, needed the work, too bad to make trouble. He handed the phone back to the road captain. Sounds like a pattern to me. And patterns like that usually mean somebody's covering for their own mistakes by pinning them on people who can't afford to fight back. But I don't have proof either, Ethan said, frustration cracking through the gratitude still flooding his chest. I've got a notebook with my own totals in it. That's it. It's my word against his, same as before. Maybe, Jim said. Or maybe it's time somebody with a little more weight starts asking questions Greg Miller doesn't want asked. He glanced at his road captain. Frank, get Denise on the phone. See if she still knows anybody at the health department, or anybody who does the books for small businesses around here. If Miller's cooking his ledgers to cover thefts he's blaming on his staff, there's going to be a paper trail somewhere, and paper trails don't lie even when people do. Ethan stood there still holding an envelope stuffed with more cash than he'd seen in years, watching a dozen strangers organize themselves around the idea of clearing his name with the same casual efficiency most people reserved for planning a weekend barbecue. You don't have to do all this, he said, though a part of him, a part that had been humiliated and dismissed and disbelieved for 2 straight years, desperately wanted them to anyway. We know, Jim said simply. We're doing it because it's right, not because we have to. The road captain, Frank, was already dialing phone pressed to his ear, walking a few steps away toward the bikes. Ethan watched him go, his mind spinning, still trying to catch up with how drastically the last 12 hours had reshaped everything he thought he understood about the world. Go inside, Jim said gently, nodding toward Lily, who was still watching everything with wide, fascinated eyes. Get her settled. Get that medicine. We'll handle Miller. Jim. Ethan's voice cracked on the name. I don't know what to say to you. Any of you. Don't need to say anything, Jim said. Just take care of that little girl. That's payment enough. Ethan turned back toward the trailer envelope clutched tight against his chest, like it might vanish if he loosened his grip for even a second, and found Lily still standing in the doorway, staring up at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face in longer than he could remember. Daddy, she whispered. Are we not going to get kicked out anymore? The question hit him harder than anything that had happened all day, harder than the eviction notice or the empty inhaler, or even Jim Hannon's envelope full of cash. His daughter, 8 years old, sick, exhausted, had been carrying the weight of that fear the entire time, quietly without complaint, because that was what she'd learned to do. He knelt down in front of her, cupping her small face in his hands. No, baby, we're not getting kicked out. Not today, not for a long time. Really, really. His voice broke on the word, and he didn't try to hide it this time. We're gonna get your medicine today. Real medicine. And we're gonna pay Mr. Hendricks, and we're gonna stay right here safe together. I promise you, Lily. This time, I really promise. Lily threw her small arms around his neck, and Ethan held her there on the doorstep of a trailer that an hour ago he'd been certain would belong to someone else by morning. While behind him, a dozen men who society had taught the world to fear organized themselves into an unlikely army, determined to make sure justice caught up with a man who'd spent 2 years mistaking cruelty for authority. It took less than 20 minutes for Frank to come jogging back, phone still in hand, an expression on his face that made Jim straighten immediately. Denise talked to a forensic accountant she knows, Frank said. Guy does work for small businesses around 3 counties, used to audit for the state before he went private. She sent him what little info we had. Dates amounts the pattern with the previous employee. He says it's worth looking into properly. Says if Miller's been altering register totals to cover shortages and blaming staff, there'll be discrepancies in his tax filings too, numbers that don't reconcile. Can he look at the actual books? Jim asked. Not without access, but he says if Ethan's got that notebook actual documented totals in his own handwriting dated, that's a start. Enough to justify somebody official taking a real look. All eyes turned to Ethan. It's in my locker, Ethan said slowly, realization dawning. At the diner, assuming Greg hasn't thrown it out already. Jim's expression hardened into something calm and dangerous. Then I think it's time we paid Mr. Miller another visit. Ethan felt a fresh spike of adrenaline, equal parts fear, and something fiercer, something that had been buried under 2 years of swallowed humiliation and was only now clawing its way back to the surface. He's not gonna just let us walk in and take it. He won't have a choice, Jim said. Not if we do this right. He turned to Frank. Get Denise to loop in that accountant properly. Tell him we may have a witness with dated records and ask if he's willing to make a formal report if the discrepancies check out. And somebody call the county health department. Ask when their last inspection was on that diner. Man who's willing to falsify his books to steal from his own staff isn't exactly the type to keep a clean kitchen either. Ethan stood there watching this unfold around him with a kind of dazed wonder. Watching men he'd have crossed the street to avoid a day earlier, organizing a genuine methodical dismantling of the injustice that had upended his life simply because they'd decided it was the right thing to do. Why does this matter so much to you? Ethan asked quietly when Jim turned back to him. The money, I understand you saw somebody desperate and you helped. But this going after Greg clearing my name, that's not charity anymore. That's a fight you're choosing to have. Jim was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant somewhere far beyond the trailer park. Because 30 years ago, he said finally, I lost a job over an accusation just like yours. Wasn't as sick a daughter involved, wasn't as desperate a situation, but the injustice of it being blamed for something I didn't do and having no way to prove otherwise that eats at a man. Changes him. I spent a long time angry about it before I figured out the only thing worth doing with that anger was making sure it didn't happen to somebody else without a fight. He looked at Ethan directly. You didn't ask for any of this. You didn't ask for a diner owner too cowardly to admit his own mistakes. And you sure as hell didn't ask for a daughter sick enough to keep you up at night wondering how you're going to afford to keep her breathing. Nobody should have to go through what you went through yesterday. Not if there's people around who can do something about it. Ethan didn't trust his voice enough to respond right away. He just nodded throat-tight watching this stranger. This man the world had taught him to fear on sight, reveal a depth of conviction that put Greg Miller and Sheriff Dawson and every small petty authority figure who'd ever looked down on him to absolute shame. All right, Jim said, straightening the softness in his expression, hardening back into purpose. Get that girl settled, get her medicine, and then let's go get your notebook back. And Ethan? He paused, meeting his eyes. Whatever Miller says when he sees us coming, you let me do the talking. He's dealt with scared employees his whole career. He hasn't dealt with anybody willing to actually stand between him and the people he's been stepping on. For the first time in longer than Ethan could remember, standing on the step of a trailer that was for now still his, surrounded by strangers who'd become something closer to allies, in the span of a single sunrise, he felt something other than fear settle into his chest. It felt impossibly like the beginning of the fight finally turning in his favor. Orchestrated corruption revelation through interconnected narrative threads seamlessly. Orchestrated corruption revelation through interconnected narrative threads seamlessly. Ethan's first stop before anything else was the pharmacy on 5th, and he made Jim wait outside while he went in with cash that still felt unreal between his fingers, buying not just one inhaler, but 2, plus the nebulizer treatment the doctor had recommended months ago that he'd never been able to afford. The pharmacist, a woman who'd watched him leave empty-handed more than once, didn't say anything about it, but her eyebrows rose slightly at the total he paid without flinching. He called Mr. Hendricks from the parking lot, his hands still trembling slightly as he dialed. Mr. Hendricks, it's Ethan Walker. A pause heavy with the expectation of bad news. Ethan, I really am sorry, but if you don't have... I have it. Ethan said, cutting him off, the words tasting sweeter than anything he'd said in years. All 600. I can bring it by within the hour. The silence on the other end lasted so long, Ethan thought the call had dropped. You have it, all of it. All of it. I'll be there. Ethan, I don't know what to say. That's wonderful news. I really didn't want to go through with it, you know that. I know, Ethan said, and found to his own surprise that he actually did believe it. Hendricks had never been cruel, just cornered by his own circumstances the same way Ethan had been cornered by his. I'll see you soon. He hung up and stood there for a second in the parking lot, letting it wash over him, the small, ordinary miracle of a phone call that didn't end in disaster. Then he climbed back into Jim's truck, which had trailed alongside the motorcycles, for exactly this purpose, and looked over at the older man behind the wheel. "Rent's handled," he said. "Medicine's handled." "Good," Jim said. "Now let's go handle the rest." The drive to Miller's diner took less time than Ethan wanted it to. His stomach tightened with every mile-old fear resurfacing, despite the envelope of cash and the fleet of motorcycles rumbling behind them. 12 hours ago, he'd walked out of that diner fired, humiliated, accused of theft he hadn't committed. Now, he was going back with an army. Jim must have sensed the tension radiating off him. "You don't have to come in if you don't want to." "No," Ethan said, surprising himself with the steadiness in his own voice. "I need to be there. It's my name he dragged through the mud. I want to see his face when the truth comes out." Jim nodded, something like approval flickering across his weathered features. "Good man." They pulled into the gravel lot just before noon, the same lot where Ethan had stood frozen with an eviction notice and $35 less than 24 hours earlier. This time, a dozen motorcycles rolled in behind them, engines cutting off one by one, until the sudden silence felt almost louder than the noise had been. Through the window, Ethan could see Greg behind the counter, and the moment Greg spotted the row of bikes pulling in his face, went the color of old paper. "Stay close," Jim murmured, and pushed open the diner door. The bell jingled absurdly cheerful against the tension crackling through the room. Greg's eyes darted from Jim to Ethan, to the wall of leather-clad men filing in behind them, and something like panic flickered across his face before he forced it down into a mask of aggressive bravado. "We're closed," Greg said, though the door was propped open, and two customers still sat in a corner booth, watching with undisguised curiosity. "Funny," Jim said, unbothered. "Sign on the door says otherwise. I don't want trouble." "Then this'll be easy," Jim said, "because we're not here for trouble. We're here for Ethan's notebook, the one in his locker, and then we're here to have a conversation about your register shortages." Greg's face flickered, a half-second crack in the composure there, and gone, but Ethan caught it, and so clearly did Jim. "That's employee property," Greg said too fast. "I already cleaned out his locker, threw the trash out this morning." "Convenient," Jim said flatly. "It's the truth." "Is it?" Jim said, not really a question, "because Ethan tells me he kept careful records of every drawer he closed out. Dated, signed, 2 years' worth in case anybody ever doubted his numbers. Now a man doesn't usually keep that kind of record unless he's already learned the hard way that his word alone doesn't count for much around here." He let that sit a moment. "So I'm wondering, Greg, whether you really threw that notebook out, or whether you found it this morning and got worried about what somebody with the right expertise might notice in it." "I don't have to answer to you," Greg snapped, though his voice had lost most of its earlier force. "Or your whole biker gang. This is my diner." "For now," Jim said quietly. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Greg's eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact." Jim's voice stayed level, almost gentle, which somehow made it more unsettling than shouting would have. "See, we made a few calls this morning. Talked to a young woman who used to work here, Sarah, I believe her name was. Left about 8 months back after you accused her of the exact same thing you accused Ethan of. Register shortage, no proof, fired on the spot. She didn't fight it. Needed the work. Too bad, moved on, tried to forget about it." Greg's face had gone pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "We also talked to a forensic accountant." Jim continued, unbothered by the denial. "Man used to audit for the state. He tells us that businesses cooking their books to cover internal theft, or maybe to cover the owner's own financial troubles, usually leave a trail. Numbers that don't reconcile at tax time. Deposits that don't match register totals. That sort of thing." He paused, letting the silence stretch, watching Greg's composure crumble by degrees. "Funny thing about paper trails, Greg. They don't care how loud you yell at the people you're blaming." "Get out of my diner," Greg said, his voice cracking on the last word. All bravado gone, now replaced by something closer to raw panic. "Get out, all of you, before I call the sheriff." "Already ahead of you," Frank said from near the door, holding up his phone. "Denise looped in a reporter from the county paper this morning, too. Seems the health department hasn't inspected this place in over 2 years. That's a violation right there before anybody even looks at your books. You can't do this, Greg said, backing toward the counter, his hands trembling visibly now. You have no right. We have every right, Jim said, and for the first time, his voice hardened into something with an edge sharp enough to cut. You took a man's livelihood over an accusation you couldn't prove on the same day his little girl was struggling to breathe because he couldn't afford her medicine. You did that without a shred of guilt, without a second thought, because you figured nobody with any power would ever bother checking your story. He took a step closer. You figured wrong. The diner door swung open again, and Sheriff Dawson walked in, hand already on his belt, eyes sweeping the room with the same suspicious hostility as the day before. What's going on here? Dawson barked. Miller, you call this in? Yes. Greg said quickly, latching onto the sheriff's arrival like a drowning man grabbing a rope. These men are harassing me, threatening my business. Nobody's threatened anybody, Jim said calmly. We're here about a pattern of falsified accusations this man's been using to cover his own financial troubles, and about a diner that hasn't seen a health inspection in over 2 years. Dawson's eyes narrowed, flicking between Jim and Greg, with obvious skepticism, clearly inclined to side with the man he knew over the strangers on motorcycles. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation, Jim said. Sheriff, I understand you don't know us, and I understand your instinct is to assume the worst about a dozen bikers showing up at a local business. But I'd ask you to consider something. Ethan Walker kept detailed records of every register he ever closed. 2 years' worth. That's not the behavior of a guilty man. That's the behavior of a man who already knew he might need to prove his innocence someday. He gestured toward Greg. Meanwhile, this man fired an employee for the second time over an unproven shortage on the same morning that employee's daughter was in respiratory distress and, by his own admission, already disposed of the evidence that might have cleared him. Dawson's expression flickered, something like doubt creeping into his previously certain hostility. He turned to Greg. That true? You threw out his records. I. Greg's mouth opened and closed. I clean out lockers when people are terminated. Standard procedure. Convenient timing, Dawson muttered, and Ethan felt a small surprised flicker of hope at the shift in the sheriff's tone. Whatever Dawson thought of the Hells Angels, apparently his suspicion of Greg's convenient story ran deeper than his prejudice, at least for the moment. That was when the diner's back door banged open, and a woman in her 30s, sharp-eyed and carrying a leather satchel, walked in with the brisk efficiency of someone who dealt with numbers for a living. Sorry I'm late, she said, glancing around the room, immediately sizing up the tension. Denise sent me. I'm Rachel Kim, forensic accountant. I understand there's a question about register discrepancies. Greg's face had gone from pale to a sickly gray. You can't just walk in here and... Actually, Rachel said, pulling a folder from her satchel with the calm confidence of someone who'd done this exact routine 100 times before. The county health department already contacted me this morning after your 2-year inspection gap came up. Turns out, failing to maintain health standards and financial record-keeping violations often go hand in hand for small businesses in trouble. So while I was already coming out for that, I figured I'd take a look at what else might be going on, given the tip about the register discrepancies. This is harassment. Greg said, his voice climbing toward hysteria now. This is a coordinated attack on my business. This is due diligence, Rachel said flatly. Do you have your financial records available for review? Mr. Miller, tax filings, deposit records, register logs for the past 2 years. Greg's silence answered the question more clearly than words could have. I'll take that as a no, Rachel said, unbothered. That's fine. I can request them through official channels if needed. But I'll tell you what I already know from the preliminary numbers Denise shared with me this morning. Your reported revenue doesn't match typical patterns for a diner this size in a town this population. There's a gap, a consistent one. The kind of gap that usually means either significant unreported theft or deliberately underreported income. That's not... Greg's voice cracked completely. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about, Rachel said. I've done this for 15 years, and I'd bet good money That gap in your numbers has been getting blamed on whichever employee you needed to get rid of that particular month. The diner had gone completely silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Every eye in the room, the two customers in the corner booth. The waitress, frozen mid-step with a coffee pot in her hand. Sheriff Dawson, Ethan Jim, all of them was fixed on Greg Miller, watching his carefully constructed authority crumble in real time. "I want a lawyer," Greg said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's your right," Dawson said, and something in his tone had shifted entirely, now all trace of his earlier hostility toward the bikers replaced by a cold professional wariness directed squarely at Greg. "But I'm gonna need you to come down to the station, Miller. Given what I'm hearing, I think we need a proper conversation about your business practices." "This is insane," Greg said, but the fight had gone out of his voice, replaced by something closer to panic. "I run an honest business." "Then you won't have anything to worry about," Rachel said, "once we look at the actual numbers." Ethan stood there watching the man who'd destroyed his morning, who'd accused him of theft and fired him without a shred of proof, unravel in front of a room full of witnesses. He'd imagined this moment 100 different ways in the hours since he'd been thrown out onto the sidewalk. But none of his imaginings had captured the strange, hollow feeling of actually watching it happen. Not triumphant exactly, just deeply quietly vindicating. "Ethan?" Jim's voice low meant only for him. "You want to say anything?" Ethan considered it. Considered all the things he could say, the insults he could return, the humiliation he could inflict in kind. But looking at Greg, now gray-faced and cornered and visibly terrified, he found he didn't want any of it. He just wanted the truth on record. "I never touched that register," Ethan said, his voice steady, carrying clearly across the diner. "Not once in 2 years. I counted every drawer twice before I closed every single night because I learned a long time ago that being honest doesn't protect you from being blamed. I just want that on the record, that's all I want." Rachel nodded, jotting something in her notebook. "Noted. And for what it's worth, Mr. Walker, if your own records are as detailed as I've been told, they'll likely corroborate exactly that once we cross-reference them against the actual numbers." "They threw my notebook out," Ethan said. "This morning, apparently." Rachel's eyebrows rose slightly, and she glanced at Greg with renewed suspicion. "Did they?" "I have copies," said a voice from the corner booth, and everyone turned to see one of the two customers, a woman Ethan vaguely recognized as a regular. Someone who came in most mornings for coffee and eggs, standing up with her phone in hand. "I take pictures of the daily specials board for my blog mostly, but I got some of the register area in the background a few times over the past couple months. Might have caught something useful. I don't know. Figured it couldn't hurt to mention it." Rachel's face brightened with the particular satisfaction of an investigator catching an unexpected break. "That would be incredibly helpful, actually. Would you be willing to share those?" "Of course." Greg looked like he might be sick. Dawson stepped closer to him, and for the first time, Ethan saw actual authority in the sheriff's posture, not the petty prejudiced hostility he'd shown the bikers yesterday, but something closer to genuine law enforcement focused now on the person who actually deserved suspicion. "Mr. Miller," Dawson said, "I think it's time we had that conversation." Greg didn't resist, as Dawson guided him toward the door, though his eyes found Ethan's for one last desperate moment. "This isn't over," he said, though the threat had no teeth left in it, just the hollow bravado of a man watching his entire world collapse. "It is for me," Ethan said quietly. "I hope it works out better for you than you made it for the people you blamed." Greg didn't respond. Dawson led him out to the cruiser, and through the window Ethan watched the man who'd fired him without a second thought climb into the back of a police car, his face buried in his hands. The diner erupted into low, astonished murmurs the moment the door closed behind them. The waitress finally setting down her coffee pot. The regular in the corner booth pulling out her phone to text someone. No doubt already spreading the news across town faster than any official report could travel. Rachel turned to Ethan, extending a business card. "I'll need your account of events for the official report, Mr. Walker. And if you can get me copies of that notebook, even partial ones, even if you only remember some of the totals, it would strengthen things considerably." "I remember most of it," Ethan said. "I can write it all out. That would help enormously. She glanced at Jim, something like curiosity in her expression. I have to ask, how exactly did all of this come together so fast? Denise called me this morning talking about register discrepancies and a health inspection gap, and by noon, we've got a man in the back of a police cruiser. Jim just shrugged, unbothered by the implicit question. Sometimes people just need somebody willing to ask the right questions out loud. Rachel studied him a moment longer, clearly sensing there was more to the story than that simple explanation, but she didn't push. Well, whatever the reason, thank you for bringing this forward. This isn't the first small business I've investigated where an owner scapegoated employees to cover their own financial troubles, but it's rare that the employee has this much support behind them to actually see it through. Most people don't, Jim said quietly. That's usually the problem. The health inspector arrived less than an hour later. Apparently, Denise's call that morning had set off more than one chain reaction, and Ethan watched from across the lot as the man walked through the diner with a clipboard, his expression growing progressively more grim with each area he examined. By early afternoon, a notice had gone up on the door, closed by order of the county health department. Word spread through Oak Haven faster than Ethan could have imagined. By that evening, the local paper's website had already posted a short article, "Diner Owner Under Investigation for Fraud Health Violations." And by the next morning, a reporter had called Ethan directly asking if he'd be willing to share his story. He almost said no. 2 years of learning to keep his head down to avoid drawing attention made the idea of publicly telling his story feel dangerous, exposing. But Jim, when Ethan mentioned it, just looked at him steadily. Your choice, Jim said. But there's a version of this story where you disappear back into the background and Miller gets a slap on the wrist and reopens somewhere else in 6 months doing the same thing to somebody new. And there's a version where people actually understand what happened, and maybe it makes the next Greg Miller think twice. Ethan thought about Sarah, the woman fired 8 months before him under the same lie who hadn't fought back because she couldn't afford to. He thought about how many others there might have been before her disposable employees blamed for a failing business's own math, too scared or too desperate to push back. I'll do the interview, he said. The article ran 3 days later, longer than he'd expected, detailing not just his own firing, but the broader pattern investigators had uncovered: falsified register logs, unreported. Income health code violations spanning back years. At least 2 other former employees who came forward once the story broke, each with their own version of the same accusation, the same abrupt firing, the same silence born of desperation. The story spread further than Oak Haven. A regional outlet picked it up, drawn as much to the unusual detail of a group of Hell's Angels intervening to help a struggling single father as to the fraud investigation itself. Comments flooded in, some skeptical, some deeply moved strangers from towns Ethan had never heard of, writing about their own struggles with employers who'd blamed them for problems they hadn't caused. Ethan read some of the comments late one night, sitting at his kitchen table, with Lily asleep soundly in the next room for the first time in longer than he could remember, her breathing finally blessedly easy. One comment stuck with him longer than the rest, a woman writing about her own father fired decades earlier, under similar circumstances, who'd never gotten the chance to clear his name before he passed. Sometimes the truth doesn't come fast enough for everybody, she'd written. I'm glad it came fast enough for you. Ethan sat with that for a long time, feeling the weight of it settle into his chest. Not just relief for himself anymore, but something larger, something about the strange, tangled web of people who'd all been failed by the same kind of casual cruelty, all carrying some version of the same wound. He looked up when he heard a soft knock at the trailer door, surprised to find Jim standing there in the porch light alone this time, no rumble of motorcycles announcing his arrival. Didn't want to wake her, Jim said quietly, nodding toward the trailer. Saw your light on. Wanted to check in. Come in, Ethan said, stepping aside. Jim sat at the small kitchen table, looking oddly out of place in the cramped space, though not uncomfortable. Ethan poured him a cup of coffee from the pot he'd made an hour earlier, more out of habit than actual need for caffeine. Health department's shutting the diner down permanently, Jim said. Talked to Frank a few hours ago. Violations were bad enough they're revoking the license, not just suspending it. and Rachel says the fraud investigation is solid enough that charges are likely. Good, Ethan said, and found that he meant it without any particular satisfaction. Just a quiet, settled certainty that this was simply how things should have gone from the start. "How's Lily?" Jim asked. "Better than she's been in months." Ethan's voice caught slightly. "Real medicine makes a difference. Should have been obvious, but when you're choosing between rent and prescriptions every month, obvious doesn't always win." Jim nodded slowly, understanding in a way that felt earned rather than performed. "You find work yet?" "Not yet. Been putting in applications." Ethan hesitated, then added, "Honestly, part of me is scared too. Every place I apply, I keep waiting for somebody to recognize my name from the article and decide I'm trouble, even though I didn't do anything wrong." "You'll find that's usually not how it goes," Jim said. "More often, people respect somebody willing to stand up when it costs them something. Employers included." "I hope you're right." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator and faintly Lily's steady breathing through the thin wall. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said finally. "Go ahead. Yesterday you said someone helped you once a long time ago, and you never got to pay them back, so you pass it forward instead." Ethan turned his coffee mug slowly between his hands. "What happened, if you don't mind saying?" Jim was quiet for a long moment. His eyes distant, in a way Ethan had come to recognize meant he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere years in the past. "I was 22, Jim said finally. "Working construction, trying to get my life together after some bad years. Foreman blamed me for equipment that went missing off a job site. Wasn't me, turned out later. It was his own brother-in-law selling it off the books, but by the time the truth came out, I'd already lost the job. Lost my apartment, was sleeping in my car for the better part of 2 months. He paused. "Man who ran the diner I used to eat breakfast at back when I could still afford it, noticed I'd stopped coming in. Tracked down where I was staying, which wasn't hard since I was staying nowhere technically, and started leaving food for me. Never made a big thing of it. Just quietly made sure I ate until I got back on my feet." "Did you ever thank him properly?" "Tried to. Went back years later, wanted to pay him back with interest. Buy the place a new sign, whatever he needed." Jim's expression turned somber. He'd passed by then. Heart attack a couple years after I'd gotten myself sorted out. Never got the chance to tell him what it meant. He looked up at Ethan. "So now whenever I come across somebody in the position I was in back then, I do what I can, because I never got to close that circle with him. This is the closest I can get." Ethan felt something thick lodge in his throat. "I'm sorry you never got the chance." "Me too," Jim said simply. "But I figure every time I help somebody else, some part of that debt gets paid anyway, just not to the person I owe it to directly." He finished his coffee and stood glancing toward the hallway where Lily slept. "You've got a good kid in there. Smart, kind. That says something about the kind of father you've been even through everything." "Thank you," Ethan said, and the words felt inadequate for everything he actually meant by them. "Don't thank me," Jim said, echoing his own words from the day before. "Just keep being the kind of man worth helping. That's thanks enough." He left a few minutes later, the low rumble of his single bike fading into the night, and Ethan stood on the step, watching the taillight disappear down the gravel road, feeling the strange, unfamiliar sensation of a life that had, against every prior indication, actually started turning toward something better. Behind him, he heard the soft creak of Lily's door, and turned to find her standing there in her pajamas, hair mussed from sleep, watching him with sleepy curiosity. "Was that Jim?" she asked around a yawn. "Yeah, baby, he was just checking on us." "I like him," she said. "He's nice, even though he looks kind of scary." Ethan smiled, the first easy, unguarded smile he could remember in longer than he wanted to admit. "Yeah," he said, scooping her up, even though she was getting almost too big for it, carrying her back toward her room. "Turns out looks don't always tell you much about a person." "Is Greg gonna go to jail?" The question, so bluntly innocent, caught him slightly off guard. "Maybe. He did some bad things and he's gonna have to answer for them." "Good," Lily said with the simple, uncomplicated moral clarity only children seem to possess. "He was mean to you." "Yeah." Ethan agreed, tucking her back into bed. He was. But we're okay now. He sat on the edge of her bed, brushing hair back from her forehead, feeling the steady, easy rhythm of her breathing under his palm, where 2 days ago there had been only frightening, ragged gasps. "We're okay now," he said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he said it and actually believed every word. 3 weeks passed before the summons arrived for Greg Miller's formal hearing, and in that time, Ethan's life had transformed in ways he still sometimes woke up disbelieving. He'd found work, real work, at a family-owned hardware store on the other side of town, a place where the owner, a stocky man named Walt, had actually read the article about him before offering the job. Man who keeps 2 years of honest records just to protect himself from a liar, Walt had said during the interview, sliding the application back across the counter without even glancing at it. "That's exactly the kind of employee I want. When can you start?" The wages weren't extravagant, but they were fair, steady, and paired with the cushion Jim's gift had provided, Ethan finally felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not wealthy, not comfortable exactly, but stable. Solid ground under his feet for the first time since Lily's mother had walked out 3 years earlier. Lily's health had improved dramatically once the right medication became a consistent part of her routine, instead of a luxury rationed out in desperate half-doses. Her color had returned, her energy climbing back to something resembling a normal 8-year-old's, and the sound of her laughter, genuine, unguarded laughter, not the careful, controlled breathing of a child managing her own crisis, had become the background music of Ethan's days in a way that still occasionally brought tears to his eyes when he wasn't expecting it. "Daddy, watch this," she called one afternoon, running full sprint across the small yard behind their trailer, arms spread wide like an airplane, breathing easy the entire way. Ethan watched her throat tight, remembering the girl who'd been afraid to sit up too fast just a month earlier. "I'm watching baby go, go, go." She collapsed onto the grass, laughing, chest rising and falling with the healthy exertion of play instead of the frightening struggle of illness. And Ethan felt something in his chest that he could only describe as pure, uncomplicated gratitude. The hearing for Greg Miller was set for a Thursday morning, and Ethan almost didn't go. Part of him wanted to leave that chapter closed entirely, to focus on the life he was rebuilding, rather than revisiting the man who'd nearly destroyed it. But Rachel Kim called him personally the week before, her voice carrying a quiet urgency. "The DA's asked if you'd be willing to give a statement," she said. "Not required, but it would help. Turns out 3 more former employees have come forward since the article ran, all with the same story, accused of theft, fired without proof, too scared or too broke to fight it. Your case is actually the strongest one because of your records." Ethan thought of Sarah, the woman fired 8 months before him, forced to leave town rather than fight a battle she couldn't afford to lose. He thought of the others, nameless to him still, who'd carried the same quiet shame for years, believing themselves the only ones believing the accusation must have said something true about them even when it hadn't. "I'll be there," he said. The morning of the hearing, Ethan dressed carefully in the one good shirt he owned, hands fumbling slightly with the buttons in a way that betrayed the nerves he'd been trying to suppress all week. Lily, staying with a neighbor for the day, had hugged him tight before he left. "You're gonna tell the truth, right?" she'd asked, with the particular seriousness only children bring to matters they don't fully understand but sense are important. "That's all I'm gonna do," Ethan promised. The courthouse was small, unremarkable, the kind of building that had seen decades of small-town disputes, far less consequential than what was unfolding inside it that morning. Ethan arrived early and found Jim already waiting outside, alone this time, dressed in a button-down shirt that looked almost foreign on a man Ethan had only ever seen in leather. "Didn't expect you," Ethan admitted, though something in him had hoped otherwise. "Wasn't gonna let you walk in there alone," Jim said simply. "Figured you'd earned some company." They sat together in the gallery as the hearing began, and Ethan watched Greg Miller enter through a side door, escorted, looking smaller somehow than Ethan remembered. Diminished the aggressive bravado that had once made him seem so formidable, now nothing more than the posture of a man clinging to the last scraps of his own denial. Rachel Kim's testimony came first, methodical and devastating in its precision. She walked the court through 2 years of financial records, laying out discrepancies with the patient, unemotional clarity of someone who dealt in facts rather than feelings. Register totals that didn't match deposits. Tax filings with numbers that bore no resemblance to actual revenue. A pattern stretching back nearly 3 years of shortages appearing precisely when Greg's own financial pressures, a failing marriage mounting personal debt, a gambling habit 2 witnesses would later confirm had reached their peak. In each instance, Rachel testified, the shortage was blamed on an employee who was subsequently terminated. In 4 of the 5 documented cases, that employee was someone with limited resources to contest the accusation. Recent hires single parents individuals without legal representation or the financial stability to pursue the matter further. Ethan felt something clench in his chest, hearing the pattern laid out so starkly. 4 other cases. 4 other people who'd carried the same shame, the same silent humiliation he had, believing themselves uniquely unlucky rather than victims of a calculated, repeated deception. Sarah testified next, the woman who'd been fired 8 months before him, and Ethan watched her speak with a mixture of recognition and grief. She described losing her apartment after the firing, moving in with her sister 2 towns over, spending months applying for jobs while explaining an unexplained gap and a termination she couldn't adequately account for. "I believed it was my fault," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "For months I actually believed I must have made some mistake, even though I knew I hadn't touched that register wrong." That's what happens when someone with power over your life says you did something. You start to doubt yourself even when you know the truth. Ethan reached over without thinking and gripped Jim's arm, needing something solid to hold on to, as the weight of what he'd narrowly avoided, what Sarah hadn't settled fully, into his chest. When his own turn came, Ethan walked to the stand with legs that felt unsteady beneath him. But his voice, when he began speaking, came out steadier than he expected. "I kept records," he said, "because after the first time Greg accused me months before the firing that ended up in the papers, I already suspected something wasn't right. I didn't have proof then. I just had a feeling that being honest wasn't going to be enough to protect me, so I started documenting everything. Every drawer, every count, dated and signed." He paused, glancing briefly at Greg, who refused to meet his eyes. "I was right to be scared. If I hadn't kept those records, if some strangers hadn't stepped in to help me prove what I already knew was true, I'd have lost everything. My home, my daughter's medicine, maybe more." The DA asked him to elaborate on the impact of the firing, and Ethan found himself describing in halting but clear detail the eviction notice, the empty inhaler, the terror of watching his daughter struggle to breathe while he had no way to help her. He hadn't planned to share that much, but sitting there under oath with Greg Miller, finally forced to hear the actual human cost of his lies, Ethan found he wanted the record to reflect exactly what had been at stake. "My daughter is 8 years old," he said. "She has severe asthma. The day I was fired, her medication had run out, and I had $35 to my name. I want that on the record because I think it matters. This wasn't an abstract financial dispute. This was a man's decision to lie about theft knowingly, to protect his own failing finances at the direct cost of a child's access to medicine she needed to breathe." The courtroom had gone very quiet. Even Greg, Ethan noticed, had finally lifted his eyes, something like genuine shame flickering across features that had spent 2 years perfecting an expression of righteous authority. The judge's ruling, delivered later that same week, found Greg Miller guilty on multiple counts of fraud, along with health code violations, serious enough to permanently revoke his business license. Restitution was ordered for each of the 5 employees identified. Though Ethan suspected correctly, as it turned out, that Greg's finances were too depleted by his own mismanagement to make those payments meaningful anytime soon. But the restitution had never really been the point, not for Ethan. The point had been the truth spoken plainly, on the record, impossible to dismiss or ignore. Sarah found him outside the courthouse after the ruling was announced, her eyes red-rimmed, but her expression lighter than Ethan had seen it all day. "Thank you," she said, "for pushing this as far as you did. I don't think I would have had the courage to testify if you hadn't already agreed to." "You had plenty of courage," Ethan said. "You just needed someone else to go first." "Maybe." She managed a small smile. "How's your daughter?" "Better," Ethan said, and felt the familiar surge of gratitude that came every time he got to say that word without qualification. "Really genuinely better." "I'm glad," Sarah said, and Ethan believed her completely. The story didn't end there. Not really. These things rarely have the tidy conclusion of a courtroom verdict, no matter how satisfying that verdict feels in the moment. But the months that followed brought a slow, steady accumulation of small good things that, taken together, amounted to something Ethan hadn't dared imagine possible just weeks earlier, an actual stable life. Walt at the hardware store promoted him to assistant manager, within 4 months, impressed by his reliability and the quiet, careful diligence Ethan brought to every task, the same instinct for meticulous record-keeping that had once saved his life, now simply making him good at his job. The raise that came with it meant Ethan could finally start setting a little aside each month, something he hadn't done in years, a small cushion against the next crisis life might throw at them. Jim visited occasionally, not often, but enough that his appearances stopped feeling like extraordinary events and started feeling like the natural rhythm of an ongoing friendship. He'd show up sometimes with the whole crew engines announcing their arrival from half a mile away, and Lily had taken to running out to greet them with an enthusiasm that made the leather-clad bikers of Oakhaven soften in ways their reputation would never have predicted. "You're like uncles," she told them once with the blunt honesty only children possess, and Ethan watched a dozen hardened men who'd weathered decades on the road react to that word with expressions of genuine, unguarded warmth. "Guess that makes us family then," Frank said, ruffling her hair, and Lily beamed like she'd been given the greatest gift imaginable. Family. Ethan had come to realize wasn't always the thing you were born into. Sometimes it was the thing that showed up on your doorstep when you had nothing left, expecting nothing in return, simply because somebody decided you were worth showing up for. He thought about that a lot in the quiet moments, washing dishes after dinner, listening to Lily's easy, healthy breathing through the thin trailer wall at night, standing in the hardware store, organizing inventory, with the particular satisfaction of honest work, honestly done. He thought about how close he'd come to losing everything over an injustice he'd had no power to fight alone, and how a group of strangers society had taught him to fear had turned out to be the only people willing to stand beside him when it mattered most. On the 1-year anniversary of that terrible transformative day, Ethan drove out to the address Jim had given him months earlier, a modest house on the edge of the county, the closest thing Jim had to a permanent home between long stretches on the road. Lily sat in the passenger seat, chattering excitedly about seeing Uncle Jim again, healthier and more vibrant than Ethan had ever dared hope she'd become. Jim answered the door with the same weathered, unhurried warmth Ethan remembered from that first conversation on the sidewalk outside a diner that no longer existed. "Didn't expect to see you two today," Jim said, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely surprised. "Wanted to say thank you properly," Ethan said. "It's been a year. Feels like it deserves marking." Jim studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, stepping aside to let them in. "Feels like it does." They sat together on Jim's small back porch while Lily explored the yard, chasing a butterfly with the boundless energy of a child who'd never spend another day gasping for breath she couldn't catch. "You know," Jim said, watching her, "when I handed you that envelope a year ago, I didn't expect to still be thinking about it a year later. Usually you help somebody, you move on, you don't always know how it turns out." "I think about it every single day," Ethan admitted. "Not just the money. The choice you made to actually see me instead of just walking past." "That's the part most people get wrong," Jim said. "They think it's about the money. It never really is. Money's just the tool. The choice is the part that actually matters, deciding somebody's worth stopping for." Ethan looked out at his daughter laughing in the yard, safe and healthy, and utterly unaware of how close she'd come to a very different fate a year earlier. "You didn't just stop for me," he said quietly. "You changed the entire direction of our lives. I don't know how you ever repay something like that." "You don't repay it." Jim said the same words he'd offered a year earlier, still carrying the same simple, unshakable truth. "You pass it forward. That's the only kind of payment that ever mattered to me." Ethan nodded, understanding now in a way he hadn't fully grasped that first desperate morning. 2 months earlier, he'd done exactly that, co-signed for a coworker at the hardware store who was drowning in medical debt after an accident, no strings attached, no expectation of repayment beyond the same simple instruction Jim had given him. Pass it forward. Somebody helped you when you had nothing. Now it's your turn. The coworker had cried when Ethan explained why he was doing it, and Ethan had understood, watching those tears, exactly what Jim must have felt handing him that envelope a year ago. The strange, quiet satisfaction of breaking a cycle of cruelty with something as simple and radical as basic human decency. "Lily's doing well," Jim observed, watching her sprint across the yard, breathless but easy, laughing at nothing in particular, the way healthy children do. "You'd never know looking at her now how bad it got." "No," Ethan agreed. "You wouldn't. Some days I have to remind myself it actually happened, that we actually came that close to losing everything. That's usually how the worst days work," Jim said. "Once you're through them, they start to feel like they belong to somebody else's life." Ethan considered that, watching his daughter chase her butterfly into the afternoon light, healthy and unafraid, and entirely secure in a world that had once seemed determined to crush them both. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if you and your crew hadn't ridden into that diner exactly when you did," he said quietly. "If Greg had fired somebody else that week, or if you'd chosen a different town to stop in for breakfast." "Don't do that to yourself," Jim said, not unkindly. "The what-ifs will eat you alive if you let them. What matters is what actually happened. You held on through the worst day of your life without giving up on your daughter, even when you had every reason to feel like giving up was the only option left. That's not luck, Ethan. That's who you are. We just happened to be there to see it." The words settled into Ethan's chest with the particular weight of a truth he hadn't fully allowed himself to believe until someone else said it aloud. He hadn't just been rescued. He'd been recognized, seen clearly, in his worst and most desperate moment by people who understood exactly what that kind of desperation costs a person, and who'd decided deliberately and without hesitation that his integrity was worth defending. Lily came running up onto the porch, then breathless and grinning, collapsing into her father's lap with the easy, unguarded affection of a child who'd never again have to wonder whether her father would be there to catch her. "Uncle Jim," she said, "can we come back next week too?" Jim laughed, warm and unguarded. "You can come back whenever you want, sweetheart. Door's always open." Ethan held his daughter close, feeling her steady, healthy breathing against his chest, watching the late afternoon sun stretch long shadows across a yard that had, for one ordinary afternoon, become the setting for something that felt very much like family. He thought about the man he'd been a year ago, desperate, humiliated, $35 from disaster, convinced that the world had no room left for people like him. He thought about how wrong that man had been, not about the danger he'd faced, but about who would show up to stand beside him when it mattered most. The road that had once seemed to lead only toward loss had turned against every reasonable expectation toward this: a healthy daughter, honest work, a found family that had chosen him without condition or hesitation, and the quiet, unshakable understanding that the truth, no matter how buried or how threatened, always finds its way back into the light when enough people refuse to look away. Ethan Walker had started that terrible morning with $35 and nothing left to believe in. He ended that year with everything that had ever actually mattered: his daughter breathing easy beside him, his name cleared and his integrity vindicated, and a circle of unlikely friends who had taught him in the space of a single unforgettable day that sometimes the family you need most isn't the one you're born into, but the one that chooses to stand beside you when you have absolutely nothing left to offer in return. And that, in the end, was a debt no amount of money could ever fully repay, only honor, only pass forward, only carry with him for the rest of his life.